Okay, we're here with something that I think I've already talked about in some regard, but we also have another tier list. So we're gonna be doing two, um, which I mean I probably should be doing this more often because I go through some of these really really fast, and I usually try and skip short ones. So at the end of the day, I think it's just better if we combine two of them. This is going to be Gears of War if you haven't figured it out. We're going to be talking about the weapons, usability in the campaign and multiplayer, and then we're going to talk about the multiplayer maps because I've already discussed the campaign in decent detail. Though I do want to maybe discuss as like the final tier list the locations of Gears of War 1 because they're really, really cool. But ignoring that, I think we should probably talk with the about the first weapon we end up encountering. So in multiplayer, the hammer burst is usually locked as like a kind of side weapon in certain spots. In Gridlock, for instance, it's in the little like corners of the map next to the boom shot. Um, there's several other maps that have the hammer burst just hanging out there. Uh, when it comes down to it, overall, the Hammer Burst is great for the campaign and kind of mid for multiplayer. It's better to have the Lancer in multiplayer, especially since you spawn with it. But in the case of the Hammer Burst, it does have fulfill a very interesting niche in campaign that the Lancer does not. Ammo, because ammo is locked to pretty much late game Lancer or just ammo boxes. The Hammer Burst is going to be your go-to for the first act, or at least for most of the first act. It also does decent amount of damage while active, and at the end of the day, is a really easy, and I do mean this, easy weapon to pick up and use. Which will go into the Lancer. I think the Lancer is slightly better, but a lot of that has to do with accessibility versus actual use. Is your general assault rifle? It's not too great in the first game. It doesn't get the stopping power that it does in Gears of War 2, and it doesn't get the variance that it does in Gears of War 3, but it's still a very, very good weapon. It's one of those that I'll straight up say, um, like, you're gonna be like, oh man, I only have one shot in all these. Well, I'll just pick up the Lancer and keep it going, baby. Like that's what you're willing to do. It also is the chainsaw, which in campaign sucks. It's miserable to chainsaw somebody. And also in multiplayer, it sucks to chainsaw somebody because then you're killed. You're literally in a 1v1 situation and you happen to get the jump on them with the chainsaw, is it's very rarely the go-to option. It's better with the Nasher, which we'll get to in a second. When it comes down to it, I do think the Lancer is slightly better, but it's not anything to write home. It's not mid, but it's just good. It's just good for a lot of situations. I do think with the glitches in multiplayer, if you're not host, um, you definitely do have an advantage if you use them. If you are a host, I think the Lancer is without doubt the best weapon because your chainsaw is like a magnet. It actually pulls people. It's insane. Let's talk about the snub pistol. It's actually broken in Gears of War 1. The snub pistol, after a certain amount of damage, will actually headshot opponents, which is really insane because some blind fires will just headshot. It has a really good melee reach, which is something the Hammer Burst doesn't. The Hammer Burst actually isn't that good in melee, in my opinion. It kind of does less damage. I think I rarely remember actually accepting using the Hammer Burst in melee unless I was desperate. The snub has a good reach. You can actually, in the campaign, if you line this up correctly, you can actually start your melee, hit uh one whatever it is in front of you, turn quickly with the camera and hit two others because of the way you're swinging. It's also the same with the bolt talk, though the bolt talk, in my opinion, is harder because the swing animation is different. Um, Overall, this snub pistol is really strong. It's also really good in multiplayer because everyone starts with it, and if we're being honest, this active is really, really powerful. It's one of the best weapons to just kind of pull out when you're like, oh, I used up Lancer just messing around, or oh, my Nasher ran out. Let me just pull this out. Like it's truly, oh, it's better to pull out your sidearm than to reload like Answer, but it's super good. The snub pistol is like one of the best weapons to just use in like weird situations entirely. It's awesome. We're going to talk about the Bolt Hawk. The Bolt Hawk sucks in Gears of War 1. It really sucks because you think this gun would be good. If you activate it is, I think, a 3-shot in multiplayer. In campaign and casual, it does have a little more use, but even then, I don't think it's that good. It has a lot of damage fall off in this game, whereas Gears of War 2 and 3 has damage fall off that makes a lot of sense, where you can kind of see where the bullets would get weaker. Gears of War 1, the damage fall off isn't as apparent, and so it's really hard to tell when certain guns, specifically the Lancer and the long shot, actually. The long shot doesn't have damage fall off in the similar sense, but we'll talk about it in a second. But it's really weird to see the damage fall off and like understand what's happening. The Bolt Hawk, like, I don't understand it. I understand there's actually probably a lot of people that think this weapon's pretty good. I think even in campaign it's really bad because limited ammo doesn't do enough damage, and in multiplayer, it's why would you give up the snub pistol? The snub pistol is without a doubt the better option. Um, we're gonna talk about grenades. Grenades are broken in Gears of War 1. Not only are they insanely good in campaign due to closing e-holes, but they are really good in multiplayer because of the way flinching works, and also at the same time you can get some really cool kills. Plus there's grenade sticking, which if you're in a 2v1 scenario, you have grenades and someone's hiding around with a chainsaw, you can actually melee them as you get chainsawed. So you basically trade your life, you guarantee the win. Overall, grenades are really, really busted. For example, Gridlock. I'm using Gridlock because it's usually the favorite. Or a good one would be uh, Station. With grenades, you can actually hunker down and play a long game and get into Nasher range for the normal Gears of War 1 fun using grenades. It's really, really good. The sniper perch in Gridlock, for instance, is like easy to abuse with the grenades. Let's talk about Nasher. The Nasher in this game is, of course, but it's actually really, really inconsistent in campaign. It's your best go-to weapon in close range in theory, but it's super inconsistent in the first game. In multiplayer, this was the multiplayer. This is the multiplayer. But if we're being honest, uh, it is host to a bunch of different advantages depending on if you're host or not. Not only are your shots much like better, there's also some really good like strategies you can pull off with this, such as two-piecing. There's backpacking. There's just in general a bunch of other tools you can use with the Nasher shotgun. Really cool shotgun. I think the thing about it that kind of puts in A for me is while this is the go-to, and I'll even get into it a lot of the time, um, you do not actually want to use this in certain situations because the spread is so wild. You can active this and it does do a lot of damage even at like closer to mid range, but it's also one of those things where you're just being stubborn and people are being stubborn and just not switching to better options. Overall, the Nasher is really good for short range. It's one of the best, but it's super inconsistent sometimes. And my favorite is that you can actually, if you know what you're doing, you can headshot two people on the right and left of you if you know what you're doing, which is really hilarious in multiplayer to see that happen. But yeah, the Nasher is insane. It definitely has it's the most inconsistent weapon on this list by a long shot. Which, by the way, long shot, broken. The long shot is broken in every capacity. In campaign, it's a little not as useful as you would think. Uh, it's one of those things where it definitely has some use, but because of the limited ammo, it definitely can fall apart. Plus, there's a lot more close ranged avenues. Whereas the sniper in multiplayer, for example, on canals, it becomes basically the best weapon in the game. Not only are headshots insta kills, cool, but if you get an active and you're playing like execution, it's a free down and you can kind of push someone into a bad scenario. Don't do that, you're a pussy if you do it, but it is an option. When it comes down to it, I do feel like the long shot is this, it's second to the Nasher in playing catch up. If you're in a 4v4 scenario on Gears of War 1, three of your teammates die to random stuff, and you're in 1v4 scenario, and you're hoping for a comeback, I think the long shot and the Nasher is your best opportunity. I will get into the torque bow and how it fits in there, but I do think that ultimately the Nasher and the long shot. Sorry, I flipped them. The long shot and the Nasher are the best like opportunity to make that comeback, which goes into boom shot. I think the boom shot is honestly in A tier. I'm gonna put it at the bottom because it's actually slightly rarer than everything else. Uh, so the boom shot is really good in campaign because it closes e-holes just as the grenades do. It's also really high damage, but it's not as common, which is the weakness in campaign. In multiplayer, there's a difference. This explosive shot is super fucking inconsistent. It is one of the most inconsistent weapons of like having the third explosion happen. So it does like a boom 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 explosion, which sounds really cool and looks really cool when it works. But the thing is, the third one just it goes in a random direction, I think, or maybe it goes in the same direction, but the hitbox just doesn't work. I don't know. If you're a good enough shot, yes, this gun is an insta kill, but at the same time, it has the fall, like the arc of the shot, and at the same time it's usually put in certain spots that are straight up like out in the open, which long shots are usually prevalent, or even just getting lancered down or stub pistoled. So it's usually a risk to go for it, and while it is useful in some maps, which we'll get into in a minute, it's ultimately not that amazing. Hammer of Dawn, it's for specifically campaign usage. In multiplayer, there's a couple maps that have it in its default, but like even then, it's usually not the go-to because there's a lot of covering in most maps, and also at the same time, the dragging of the beam isn't that strong. It's just the initial explosion. Um, it's really not that impressive. And then we have the torque bow, which I think is honestly it's probably the best weapon. It's arguable whether you think the long shot is better for general use. It also has more ammo, but I think the torque bow in general is super strong in multiplayer and in campaign. In campaign, it comes a lot later, so it doesn't get as much use, but by the time you get it, there's a lot more ammo. You're also able to kill boomers a lot more consistently. There's certain setups you can do to actually close e-holes if you know what you're doing. There's also just in general a lot of cool stuff. Its melee is really sick in my opinion. It's one of my favorite sounding melees, which is just personal preference, but it's really cool. Above all, I do think that this basically if you're at C, you're mid. Like there's a use for this and that's cool. D is the only bad weapon and the rest are really good. I just think torque bow, long shot, and grenades are like without a doubt the best like hoo-ha. Like we're choosing these weapons. The snub, the Nasher, and the boomer. Boom shot. Why am I saying boomer? But the boom shot are all something you take as like you're of course gonna use them, right? If given the option, these are your go-to in certain scenarios. Nasher is like the general like all the time along with the snub, but the boom shot, if you see it, or you're gonna pick it up. A lancer you start with, and the hammer burst is if you don't have a lancer, might as well have it. So I think that's a pretty good tier list because now we're gonna go into multiplayer. Uh, so some of these multiplayer maps, if you don't know, are very rarely played in Gears of War 1. For example, Process. Process is very rarely played because it's not that fun. But let's get into, I think we'll go in order. So Bullet Marsh, if you don't know, is actually a pretty miserable map, but it's not bad. It has a lot of like what I like to call bullshit spots for certain people that like to long shot whore. There's a lot of angles that you just are going to be at disadvantage. The spawns, in my opinion, are not balanced. And the default weapons don't really matter because they're put in spots that you're basically in the open. Bullet Marsh, in my opinion, is one of my least favorite maps. It's still not as bad as two of these. There's two maps I'm thinking of that I think are pretty miserable. But yeah, overall, it's just C. It's mid. It works. Canals. I think Canals is one of the best maps Not only is it a great learning experience on the little side path over here of Nasher gameplay if you're just into the game, but you have the long shot battles that happen with default spawns. You have the usually people change the mid spawn sometimes, but like torque bow is usually there. There's also a spot for a hammer burst over here, which why would you do that? Grenades are on top, so you on top of middle bridge, so you can actually use grenades. Overall, most of the action will happen in the middle bridge or in the far ranging shots of the two spawn bridges. The spawns I think are pretty even. I do know that the one we are looking at, that spawn in the back, is actually technically faster than the one behind us, but it's only like a very minuscule amount. If you mess up your movement or you get hooked on one of your teammates, you're going to be about the same speed or even slower, so it doesn't really matter. Canals is a very fair and balanced map. I think it incorporates a lot of long range gameplay, which doesn't really happen that fairly in a lot of these maps, which is, it's really cool. And then we have the Nasher segment where you can go in the long range, but because of the amount of cover that's over in that little section, it goes really well into like a kind of whack-a-mole scenario where you can get the advantage on people. Clock Tower. Clock Tower, when I was thinking the other day, I totally forgot that this is the name of the map. Clock Tower, I think, is honestly... Oh, man, this is hard. Because a part of me wants to put in A. But there is also a really irritating, like, side of this map, which... I think this is the first map that it really becomes a problem on specific game modes. I'm specifically talking about Execution and Annex. Because in Clock Tower, we're looking at one side here. You spawn actually like slightly back into the right on one side, and then completely over this little hill here on the other side is the other spawn. But there's a little spot where you go and get boom shot. It's really far out of the way. There's a long shot so you can get sniped. Nobody cares. It's basic. Overall, most of this map is very fun and I think engaging, but there's a spot under a certain portion of the map where grenades are, and if you're playing Annex, it becomes probably one of the most annoying spots in the game. I think Annex makes it unfun. Plus, if someone is hiding for Execution, it can get really, really irritating because you just want to go into the next match and they're just being a bitch. Overall, I do think it's still A as long as you're not against trash people that actually hide like total bitches. But at the end of the day, there is something to be said about not being an S. I don't think it would ever be an S. This is low A. But Escalation's also the same way. There is a way to hide in theory, but it's also counteracted by the default spawns of weapons. You spawn up top and below, which actually gives advantage to the top people. But ignoring that, I do think this is a very fun map. I don't think it's fair, but grenade spawn means that you can't hide in the side pockets. You also can't hide in this little corner for free. There's corners right here that you're basically immune from every sight line. So grenades are your only option to catch them. When it comes down to it, I do think Escalation is very recognizable and fun. But one of my favorite moments never really comes up, and that's getting in a Nasher fight in this middle, fountain area at the very bottom. Very rarely comes up because most of the shots are like long shots or on the stairs, and yeah, stairs are really wacky in Gears of War 1. Fuel Depot, one of my favorite maps, honestly. I will say it's not very fun for a lot of people that didn't play back in the day, because now as we get if you try and go and play Gears of War 1, a lot of people know how to abuse this map. This map is very abusable. There's a lot of interesting sight lines. The two long shots areas. Thank you, dog. Definitely heard that, I'm sure. But what are you doing? I don't know. But Fuel Depot, at the end of the day, has like two interesting sight lines that I think are really, really cool. It also has Hammer of Dawn default spawn, which it actually has really fun shenanigans with this gas pump here. But most of the map is in cover in a warehouse, or there's one of the spawns is straight up covered. So I don't know. One of the spawns is really fun to get in a weird back and forth fight. But when it comes down to it, I do think that this is just B. It's one of my favorites personally, but yeah, I think Garden is one of the worst maps. Not only are the spawns pretty unfair, one spawn like it looks like it's trying to be fair, but one of the spawns straight up just sets you up slightly back, so one spawn will be ahead in the map control. Also, a lot of the areas I think are leaning towards Nasher gameplay. Just have like certain things where you try and get off cover, and because of the way Gears of War 1 cover is, you actually just kind of slide a bit instead of actually getting off cover. It's really, really annoying. Uh, and there's a lot of just irritating collision in Garden. I understand that this is probably for a lot of people the weird pick. A lot of people could agree with most of what I've said in varying ways. Of course, they'd probably move it up or down, but I do know a lot of people actually think Garden's okay. I don't think it's a fun map. I think this map sucks. Gridlock, I think, is literally always going to be S. It's literally the most recognizable multiplayer map, besides one of them, which is Mansion, which I actually think is A. We'll get into that in a second. Um, let's talk about Gridlock. Gridlock is literally the generic, hey, you want to play a Gears game? Yeah. Gridlock? Yeah. And there you go. You're done. You have the sniper spot, which is very risky sometimes. You have the grenades right below it. You have the boom shot. Usually, most of the people I played with changed the default spawns of the hammer burst over here to torque bows. And overall, you had the really fun Nasher side spots when you push someone off of sniper. They're like, oh, I'm gonna go Nasher and hide in these blocks. It's also pretty famous for the Kung Fu flip, which is, you know, prevalent. It's also the easiest to crab walk, which kind of sucks, but whatever. You have a long range fight, but there's a lot of sight lanes that are cut off by this pillar right here, and overall, you can't cover everything in the map by one sight line. It's really, really fun for long range, and it's really, really good for close range. I think this map is really, really well done. It's probably the best map in the game. Um, but there's a couple that I do like. We'll talk about Mansion. The reason it's in top of A and not in S is because the outside is really, really boring. It becomes very much a whoever has this high ground type scenario kind of wins the fight, because you can actually see their head and they can't see you at all because of the way sightlines work. Your aiming literally can't hit them. The sniper in the middle is really fun to have, but the sightline, you literally have three sightlines to watch, and like the thing about it is that the long shot user just loses here. Both spawns I think are fine, and that's why it's here, but it really is just a good map with a boring section and the long shot being basically garbage. Unless you're activating, which then you're a bitch, as I've already said. Mausoleum, hidden boss of Gears of War 1 multiplayer maps. I think Mausoleum is actually very fun. It basically is actually like two sides of the map separated by a single like hallway, with, you know, your spawns being also the secondary hallways. Basically, it can become kind of a very controlling map where you're like in execution, you're like, oh, I'm gonna go control the left way, and then your teammates are like, okay, we'll control the right way, and you have your battles, and maybe you win both or not. I do think that this side is way better than the Fountain side personally, but hey, I think this map is actually really, really fun and balanced, and more importantly, there's a lot of overview like stuff if somebody's camping real hard that you can punish them. Grenades are actually really fun on this map because of the way like there's so much cover in this map that you can actually hook it and then trap somebody and kill them with it. There's a lot of strategy that can go into it. The problem I do have to say is that for the case of a fair like 1v1, this map becomes very, very boring because it's a lot of cover whoring, where you're just going around zipping through, gain one shot, you miss your big chance, and while you could go for it, you might die, and then you just back off and do it again if you're still alive. It basically becomes that in this area specifically. The Fountain, I think, is really boring, especially because you can just kind of cover whore all the way around the Fountain, get off, and then get back on real quick. Not very fun, and that's why it's in B. I do think this is one of my favorite like hidden maps. Like everyone knows about Canals, Gridlock, Escalation, Clock Tower. Well, not so much Clock Tower, but Mansion. Mausoleum, I think, is really good. Old Bones. when I was younger, I thought this map was down here or even like in C. As I've gotten older, I do think Old Bones is up here. It's actually a very balanced and like just a fun long shot map where there's a lot of sight lines, there's a lot of like swarming opportunities. I do think Old Bones is actually really, really good. There's not much more to say. There's actually like this map and another map, which we'll get to last, um, have a very similar like ideology. It's just the last one, War Machine does it so much better, where everybody can kind of see everything, and there's small segments where you can't see that person, but you still know where they are. It's basically a hey, come and fight me map, even if it's long range, or hey, come and fight me over here for some Nasher gameplay. Like overall, that's what Old Bones and War Machine, which we'll get to, are. Process, I think Process is okay. I do think it's better than Bullet Marsh. It's a little more fair. There's a lot more going on. I just don't like how it looks in general. I feel like there's a lot more with Bullet Marsh. It's pretty prominent that you can kind of hide different ways, but Process, there's a lot of weird spots you can hide as Locust, and you straight up can't see them. It's a little unbalanced in that regard. I don't remember the spawns being too problematic, uh, but I do want to say the center of the map is pretty garbage. Um, but overall, it's fine. Raven Down. This is the smallest map, and it's actually really, really fun. I'm gonna put it at bottom of A. I'm actually gonna beat Clock Tower because it's so small. It's really, really fun. Raven Down is, I think, it was the ranked staple for a long, long time because it's quick, easy, and you can just go in and out real fast. The matches you would play, while if you're not playing Annex or Execution, were fine. Annex, I think, is pretty shitty on this map because it takes forever because you're just dying constantly. And Execution, I think there's too much like circle camping you can do. Um, but that's mostly like a player by player basis. I do think Raven Down's incredibly good. Rooftops, I think, is fun, but I don't know. There's something wrong with this map where it's like really unbalanced. I do like its design. I like a lot about it, but uh, I don't know. I feel like there's something incredibly wrong with it. There's a lot of really cool spots in rooftops. Hammer of Dawn also, if I don't remember its default. I rarely play on this map anymore, but or I didn't play a lot of it in general. But Hammer of Dawn actually gets some really cool like use here. It's probably the only map where Hammer of Dawn is actually like really fun to use because there's a lot of like coverings and weird spots. Overall, very fun. Subway. I think this map is garbage. Uh, I think Subway is really, really boring. Uh, and honestly, I think I this is one map I think you can actually just look at this and you can actually see the personality of Subway. Like you can see Process, you're like, oh, that looks interesting. Rooftops, okay. Bullet Marsh, a little dark, but whatever. Even Garden has more personality. Subway is just boring. Tyra Station, I think, is straight up always gonna be the top of C. I do like the underground like little battle you have, but when it comes down to it, I do think Tyra Station is just like sometimes it can get very campy, and it's because of the train. It's really cool to have that train. It's also very glitchy, but at the end of the day, I do think like this is a very camp heavy. It is too big and too like involved for a 4v4 situation, which is the only one because like canals you could cross pretty fast, mansion same, escalation same. Like you could put yourself in disadvantage doing this, but you could still cross it. This one you're putting yourself in disadvantage. You have a timing thing to worry about, and above all, it's bad. But it's still fun to play on every now and then. I think War Machine is, of course, S. I discussed kind of the problems that Old Bones had. War Machine doesn't have a lot. This is a lot more less over centralizing of a map. There's a lot more cover. There's also a War Machine or Troika in the center, which is fun, I guess. But at the same time, I do want to discuss that when it comes down to War Machine, I feel like you can have a lot more memorable battles in certain segments than you can in Old Bones. Old Bones, it feels like there's very much here's the spot where you use Nasher, here's the spot where you use this. Whereas War Machine has these kind of overviews for medium range that I think are very, very fun. both spawns kind of set yourself up to be like a kind of like line that is waiting to go. Where it's like, okay, if I go in center, I'm now out of cover in certain scenarios, so I can now be just bullied down. So you have to kind of worry about that coming out of spawn. And above all, I do think this is one of my favorite maps to actually play like a true competitive game, because there's a lot that you can do strategy wise. Whereas I talked about Gridlock, the different ways you can go, and Canals kind of has a more linear fashion. It just happens to do them incredibly well. War Machine, I do think, is one of my favorite maps to play competitively, because it straight up feels fair the whole way through. There's a lot of like sight lines that you can use to get some free damage if you're going that route. There's a lot of natural gameplay you can do, and above all, a lot of the map spawns in general are really, really strong in making sure you don't get bullied out. I do think this is pretty good. I I understand some people will probably disagree with Garden. Subway is always going to be an F, and people that disagree are wrong. But overall, did two quick tier lists. What's your favorite weapon in Gears of War in general? What you think is the best, anyway? And what's your favorite map in Gears of War 1? This is specifically Gears of War 1. I might do Gears of War 2 down the line. But yeah, that's it for right now. I'll catch you guys later.